Thank you very much. Before we begin discussing the global order, I'd like to talk a little bit about a very troubling local order here in Israel. Honored guests, in October, we started operating here in this army camp, and then in 1995 we started working as a very tired and very hard-working staff and students, and we cried over the murder of Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin was head of the Harel Brigade during the War of Independence, and 50% of its soldiers died in the battle for Jerusalem. The leader of the Six-Day War, as the chief of staff, he was murdered. He was assassinated, and as we all thought that it is impossible for a Jew to murder, the prime minister of the Jewish state faced a very difficult reality. This murder, this assassination, was not only the murder of a person who had dedicated his entire life to the state of Israel, it was a rebellion against the civil order, against a prime minister, an elected prime minister who was pursuing a national policy. He was assassinated in order to assassinate a national policy. It was a difficult situation because today we're facing a similar situation of horrific incitement and maybe even more extreme than what was said at the time. Just a week ago, Ms. Ilana Saporta sent a letter to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett demanding that he resign or be assassinated. And in order to show how serious she was, she sent another letter, and to both letters she included a bullet, and she threatened not only the Prime Minister, she threatened his son and his wife. After that, we heard many different statements, different horrible statements, like someone from Elad who said that a bullet should be put into his head. And if you think that the trauma of those years will not return, it could happen in the current situation. And it is our obligation to prevent a recurrence of such an incident and prevent the deterioration that leads to incitement against an elected government of Israel. And this attack, which demands the efforts not only of the security personnel, Ms. Saporta should be put in jail for the rest of her life. But it requires more than that. And the threat is not only on an elected prime minister, it is a threat to the entire political method, the political system here in Israel. And people are very creative here, and the Knesset members, like David Amsalem, suggested the idea of imprisoning the judges. Former MK Chaim Yogev suggested the agricultural solution of demolishing the Supreme Court with the D9, or examples of talking about blowing up the Supreme Court. We must not live with illusions. We're talking about attacking the entire regime, all aspects of the leadership in Israel. And this attack has ideological basis because the belief is that the only democracy there is the legal aspect of assessing the legislations, because the ultra-Orthodox population believe that only the Torah law, only the religious law, is the deciding factor, and therefore the Supreme Court, the entire court system and legal system, has to be destroyed. This is there are religion groups. There's murders of Jewish by Jewish criminals and between Arab criminals, and people feel threatened. That if they're threatened, people have to realize that there will be retaliations. But in addition to all that, there is a significant threat on the part of something that is close to a rebellion, although among a small part of the Arab population. But these actions are extremely severe, and this is not something we could take for granted. This population, this group, which is a small group, and we have to treat the entire Arab population based on democratic values, but these small groups are responding to the most extreme calls against the existence of the State of Israel, whether from Jihad, Hamas, or Hezbollah. And I would like to remind you here of the famous speech made by Herzl in London in 1896, when he first presented his vision of a Jewish state. And he said that he could not guarantee that in the country the skies will always be blue, but I can promise one thing, and that is that it is necessary that we can guarantee that that Jews will never be persecuted for religious or national reasons. And this is something that is guaranteed by our political vision, the idea of a Jewish state. And the current disruption of this idea is reflected in pogroms in the mixed cities and in the nearby Arab cities. And these incidents we cannot compromise and we cannot forgive. We must understand that in these cases we are not talking only about violence. We're talking about uprising against the notion of a Jewish state. It is a nationalist ideology that attempts to strike against Jews solely because they are Jews. We could talk about using force to fight against what is happening in society. We must definitely strengthen the police forces, and in certain cases, we must also force is necessary. We will not tolerate violence of any kind. We have to defend the regime, and the legal system must ensure that people pay the price for their crimes. But force is not the solution. The solution is to go back to understanding the fundamental values that we share, that our society is built upon. We have to rebuild from the beginning, from the foundations. We have to rebuild our national consensus. We need the initial agreement that was signed by all of the people, all of the factions, all of the different parts of Israeli society, and that is the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. This declaration calls for peace. It calls for equal citizenship, provided that there is peace between the different sectors. It calls for equality, and it calls for the right path and the right way of running a nationalist country that was established as a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people, while maintaining the fundamental rights and values that guided us even as minorities in the diaspora. And I want to say clearly that this institution was established this is a Zionist university that was based on the values of the Declaration of Israel, and that is the social vision of this institution. And I would like to conclude by expressing my complete support for the initiative of the Minister of Finance, Lieberman, who called to pass a new basic law with one line that says that the Declaration of Israel that was of 1948 is a basic law.